For the past few months in the Game Boy Color chronology series, we've been stuck on one particular day in the calendar, December 1st, 1998. Title after title seemed to first appear on that day. It was never ending. On the surface, for the Game Boy, it all seems pretty rosy. We've just got a brand new, full color version of the console. The original Game Boy's winding down and enjoying its second retirement after being brought back from the dead by the Pokemon phenomenon a few years earlier, but there are still new games releasing for the Color that you can play on it. It wasn't until the start of 1999 that color-only cartridges would start to appear, and then it was a slow transition. Plus, despite the limited number of launch titles, no less than 16 games would be released in North America on December 1st alone. So in theory, we'd have a bunch more choice now. So why was December the 1st, 1998 the darkest day in Game Boy history? Well, you want a reason? I'll do you better. Here's 10. 1. Loads of colorized re-releases. We'd see a whole bunch of games that had not long been out on the monochrome platform simply colored in and put out again. Nothing to the level of Wario Land or Pocket Bomberman, but instead would get very mid-card games like Las Vegas Cool Hand, Shanghai Pocket, Montezuma's Return, Reservoir Rat, and Super Breakout coming out less than a year after their original versions. None of these are bad games as such, but it's hard to accept their existences as anything other than just cash-ins. Power Quest does get a pass here as it's an awesome game and was only released in Japan before this, so we'll excuse that one. Otherwise, it was the sort of cheap bloat that the whole Game Boy Color library suffered with, and we got a load of it all on the same day. 2. David A. Palmer make boring platformers. As for the new games that came out on that darkest of days, Gex Enter the Gecko is certainly not the worst, but it's one of those mascot-driven platformers where a franchise more successful on home consoles gets a shoddy Game Boy spin-off. Talk about library bloat. While this isn't particularly terrible, there's little enjoyment to be found. It's the abundance of stuff like this that give the Game Boy Color its seemingly deserved reputation of being a quantity over quality library. Down the exact same line as Gex, and in fact made by the same developers, Pitfall Beyond the Jungle is a bland, uninteresting entry into a franchise that seemed to exist for the sole reason of checking a box. These are the hardest games to write reviews for in a way because there's little positive to say, but similarly there's nothing that the games do majorly wrong, aside from you can almost guarantee that the controls will only be half thought through and a bit rubbish. No, they're just really boring. 3. Looney Tunes Twubble. At least this one isn't a bullshit platformer like so many of the others, but the controls are still a shonky mess and the puzzle-solving aspect of the game is just not interesting in the slightest. Find a thing, take it to the place, drop the thing. Die a bunch because Sylvester got stuck on a corner or didn't move in the direction you thought he would. Lazy, irritating, boring. And honestly, that's the worst. Be good or bad, just don't be boring with it. 4. NFL Blitz. Sports games were probably the most miserable part of the original Game Boy library. Most of them were unplayable garbage. December 1st, 1998 ensured anyone hoping for better on a new console was left completely deflated. NFL Blitz, and indeed its two sequels, but they'd come later, is just foul to play on Game Boy Color. A different genre perhaps, but the same issues. Anything that made the console or arcade version feel so good to play has not been translated at all. All the soul has gone, and to top it all off, the frigging controls don't even work. Digital Eclipse and Midway Games weren't done though. They'd also team up on this day to create 5. Rampage World Tour. Again, this is one of those that isn't inherently terrible, it's just boring and bad enough to kill any enthusiasm you might have to play it for more than a little bit. Totally soulless and joyless compared to the console versions, and I refuse to accept that it has to be that way. There are plenty of wonderful Game Boy games out there. Just make something like that instead of stripping back the originals to the point where there's nothing left. 6. Mortal Kombat 4. You thought those games were bad? Just hold on to your lunch there, fella. It gets worse. Mortal Kombat was a difficult trilogy to put onto the original Game Boy. 1 was quite average, but it was at least original for its time. The sequel improved on things a lot and was actually pretty playable by all accounts. The later SNK titles kicked its ass, obviously, but again, for the time, quite impressive. Then number 3 came along, and we all thought that that was as bad as it could possibly get. There'd be plenty of reason for optimism on a new console, but somehow Mortal Kombat 4 on Game Boy Color managed to be the worst of all of them, and it wasn't even close. Maddening. 7. Quest for Camelot. Want to know how to attempt to rip off Link's Awakening and spectacularly fail at virtually every step? Look no further than whatever the hell this is. There's so much wrong with Quest for Camelot. Oracle of Ages and Seasons couldn't come quickly enough. At least the source material here wasn't anything we'd lament being used in such a way. This game finding its way onto Nintendo Switch Online's Game Boy emulator before literally hundreds of more worthy choices is kind of embarrassing, if you ask me. 8. Men in Black, the series. My absolute nemesis so far in my Game Boy reviewing career is not LJN, not Ocean, or even Bandai. They all have plenty of rubbish, sure, but equally they all redeem themselves plenty as well. No, it's UK turd shovelers Tiertex. Literally not a one of their double-figure portfolio is worth the chipboard it's printed on. The end-of-days Disney explosion the DMG console suffered is littered with reams of miserable movie tie-ins by Tiertex, but it wasn't just Disney games they inflicted us with. The Game Boy Color library kicked off with 2 of their absolute worst. First, Men in Black's animated show got one of the most inaccurate, unplayable run-and-gunners going, if you can even use that term for this. A platformer with basically no platforms, invisible death traps, ridiculously programmed hitboxes, and bonkers controls. Surely it can't get worse than this, can it? 9. Disney Pixar A Bug's Life. Yep, literally the same day as Men in Black, Tiertex teamed up with my other worst enemies, THQ, to create what is, to date, my least favorite Game Boy Color game going. A Bug's Life epitomizes the moniker shovelware. The movie was moderately popular for a few months around now at least, and so to capitalize on that, this interrupted wank of a game found its way onto shelves, with reviewers seemingly paid off for some semi-decent write-ups. My god, man, has there ever been any decency in the world? 10. A Sign of the Times. The main reason why December 1st, 1998 is the darkest day in Game Boy history isn't even just the games that came out on that day, it's the sheer quantity of them, all at once. This opening of the sewer floodgates feels like such a damning letter of intent. Never before now had the Nintendo seal of quality meant so little, and with the first real post-launch title wave of Game Boy Color titles being either average at best re-releases or utterly miserable originals, you can 100% see where the Game Boy Color got its reputation from. It feels like such a relegation. The original Game Boy was like the NES or the SNES's little brother, providing audiences with portable alternatives and really strong individual games. The Game Boy Color, right from the off, feels like that evil twin you keep chained up in the attic, or like that estranged cousin who did some dodgy stuff years back and now isn't welcome at Christmas anymore. Over 12 years, the original Game Boy had just over 1,000 releases. Not all of them good, granted, but it was a healthy portfolio. All told, the Color would nearly reach that number in a third of the time, and it's because of games like what we've just talked about that get shoveled onto the system faster than we could even keep up, with nary a thought to quality at all. Let's just quickly look at what else was going on in the world of video gaming around this time. I mean, Ocarina of Time had recently come out. Who in their right mind would choose any of this over that? The first Grand Theft Auto game was a game changer. Half-Life was only a fortnight old. 1998 was an amazing year for gaming, all told. The Game Boy had always been quote-unquote weaker than its contemporaries, but it still had its place and it was still respected. At the end of 1998, for the first time ever, the Game Boy family of consoles looked absolutely leagues behind everything else.